Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. So glad you could join me today for our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Today we'll be reading chapters 31 and 32. So, just a brief recap. By the way, I do want to apologize. We had our Friday show a little bit late. That got posted late, and I apologize for that. So hopefully you've had a chance to catch up on the two previous chapters in preparation for today's. We are back live again today, and we should be live for the foreseeable future. So I'm so glad that hopefully you've made it through and you've been able to keep up with the reading here. As far as the last two chapters go, just a brief recap. Our heroes went to well, first of all, the Captain Nemo, explained to our captives that there is in fact a tunnel that exists in the Red Sea that nobody knows about, and that they will be able to pilot the Nautilus through this. It's large enough to fit a submarine, and it will take them into the Mediterranean. So they do that. The captain himself mans the helm and steers the submarine through this tunnel. And once they reach the other side, they do a little bit of hunting. They hunt a dugong, of all things, and and that was kind of it as far as the Arabian Tunnel, as they called it. In the chapter after that, since they're getting closer, or it seems to me that they're getting closer to civilization, getting closer to Europe, they are starting to realize, especially Ned Land, the harpooner, um, starting to feel like, hey, even though we're having such a good time eating lots of good food and having some adventures and doing some hunting, uh, we're still captives. And so as a result, no matter what else is going on, he still wants to get off of the submarine. He wants his freedom, and he wants to escape. And he's trying to convince Professor Aronnax and Conseil to do that. And basically, Professor Aronnax kind of gives up. He doesn't really have a good reason to stay on board the Nautilus other than his own desire to learn more about the sea, to see in the these odd places, that they have experienced up to this point. Um, and this is all something that he knows would never be something he could do once he returns to Europe. So he would like to stay on board the Nautilus just for the education of it all, but he doesn't want to be selfish and doesn't want to keep his friends there with him, since they obviously do not want to be there. And so they discuss the idea of escape. And basically he puts it in Ned Land's hands. He said, when you give the order, Ned, if you can find a time that you think we can all escape, as long as it's sensible and as long as it's reasonable, and we all have a reasonable chance of uh, succeeding, then we'll just go. Just say the word and we'll go. And so that's the agreement. And then later on in that same chapter, Captain Nemo takes the Nautilus to an underwater volcano where several islands are now being formed. They're in just the beginning stages, and it's this volcano that is erupting. And even though the temperature is about 30 degrees as far down in the water as they are, the submarine keeps heating up, and they wonder why until they see Captain Nemo. They ask him, and he says, "We are directly over the the funnel of a underwater volcano, and that's what's heating up the Nautilus, basically." And he says, and Professor Aronnax is saying, "But if we stay here, we're going to die." And he says, "Yes, we should probably move." And so they do, and it sort of makes you wonder what is Nemo thinking, because it's sort of like, and we don't know this as far as the reading goes, but it leads one to believe that maybe he kind of has overheard or can hear their conversation, and knowing that they are plotting to escape, he's trying to tell them, by the way, if you leave the Nautilus, you're going to be exposed to dangerous things. Here's an example. So the timing of it leads one, I think, to believe that the captain is sort of aware of this, and just wants to sort of warn them. By the way, don't get any ideas of escaping or getting off the Nautilus, because you know bad things can happen in the ocean, just like good things can too. So, with that in mind, if you are ready, and I'm ready, let's begin chapter 31, which is entitled Through the Mediterranean in 48 Hours. The Mediterranean, the bluest of all seas, the great seas of the Hebrews and the sea of the Greeks, and the Mare Nostrum of the Romans, bordered with orange trees, aloe, cactus, sea pines, scented with the perfume of the myrtle, framed by rugged mountains, saturated with a pure, clean air, and yet incessantly troubled by volcanic action, is a true battlefield in which Neptune and Pluto still struggle for dominion of this world. There on its banks and waters, as Michelet said, man gains new strength in one of the most invigorating climates of the globe. But however beautiful it may be, I was only able to get a rapid glimpse of its basin, which covers an area of 850,000 square miles. Even Captain Nemo's knowledge was of no help to me, for this enigmatic person didn't appear once during our rapid crossing. I estimated that it took the Nautilus 48 hours to travel about 1,300 miles beneath the surface. We left Greek waters on the morning of February 16th, and by sunrise on the 18th, we had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar. It was obvious to me that Captain Nemo did not like the Mediterranean, surrounded as it was by those countries he was fleeing. Its waves and breezes brought him too many memories, or perhaps regrets. He no longer had the same freedom of movement as in larger oceans, and his Nautilus felt hemmed in by the shores of Africa and Europe. We traveled at a speed of 25 knots, and it therefore goes without saying that Ned Land, to his great annoyance, had to give up plans of escape. He couldn't use the dinghy while we were cruising at over 40 feet per second. Leaving the Nautilus under such conditions would have been like jumping from a train traveling at the same speed. A rash move, if ever there was one. Moreover, the submarine only surfaced at night to renew its air supply. It was guided merely by its compass and log. I therefore only saw the Mediterranean as the traveler in an express train sees the landscape rushing past, or, in other words, only the objects farther away and not in the foreground, which passes by with the speed of lightning. Nevertheless, Conseil and I were able to observe several types of fish whose powerful fins permitted them to keep up with the Nautilus for short periods of time. We stayed on watch at the windows of the lounge, and our notes permit me to describe the animal life of the Mediterranean. Of the various fish living there, some I saw clearly, others I merely glimpsed, and there were yet others completely hidden from our view by the Nautilus's speed. I therefore hope I will be allowed to classify them according to these three rather odd categories. This will give a better idea of what I saw. In the midst of the waters, brilliantly illuminated by our electric light, I saw 3-foot-long lampreys of a kind found in all seas. There were Oxyrhynchidae, a kind of ray 5 feet across and with a white belly and a spotted ash-gray back. looking like vast shawls carried off by the ocean currents. Other rays passed by so fast that I could not tell whether they merited the names of eagles given them by the Greeks, or that of rats, toads, or bats, which modern fishermen have bestowed on them. 12-foot-long Melander sharks, a species particularly feared by divers, vied with each other in speed. Thresher sharks, 8 feet long and gifted with a very sensitive sense of smell, passed by looking like blue shadows. Spheroid dorados, some of which measured over 4 feet in length, passed dressed in silver and azure, surrounded with stripes, all contrasting sharply with the somber hue of their fins. These fish, once upon a time sacred to Venus, had golden eyebrows above their eyes. They were a valuable species, equally at home in salt or fresh water, living in rivers, lakes, and oceans, and able to withstand any climate or temperature. They are also a rarity in that they have conserved all the beauty of their forebears in geological times. Magnificent sturgeons, 9 or 10 feet long and able to travel at great speeds, hurtled against the windows of the lounge, letting us get a glimpse of their bluish backs covered with little brown spots. These fish, which are like a weaker variety of shark, are found in all the world's oceans. In the spring, they like to go up large rivers, struggling against the currents of the Volga, Danube, Po, Rhine, Loire, and Oder, and they live on herring, mackerel, salmon, rockling. Although they belong to the class of cartilaginous fish, their flesh is delicate, and they are eaten fresh, dried, or salted. And once upon a time, they were brought triumphantly to Lucullus's table. But as the Nautilus cruised near the surface, those inhabitants of the Mediterranean which I could best observe belonged to the 63rd genus of bony fish. They were tunas, with their blue-black backs, silver bellies, and dorsal stripes giving off a golden gleam. They were said to follow vessels in search of shade from the hot tropical sun, and they did just this with the Nautilus, as they had once done with La Perouse's ships. For hours they would race against us. I never tired of admiring these creatures, so beautifully built for speed, with their small heads, streamlined bodies up to 10 feet long, extraordinarily powerful pectoral fins, and forked tails. Like certain birds, they swam in triangle formation, which caused the Greeks and Romans to say that these fish knew about geometry and strategy. Nevertheless, they do not escape Provençal fishermen, who esteem them as much as did the inhabitants of Propontis and Italy, and thousands upon thousands of these precious animals hurl themselves blindly and heedlessly into the nets awaiting them. I will mention, only as a reminder, those Mediterranean fish of which Conseil and I merely got a fleeting glimpse. There were whitest gymnotes, which swept past like clouds of mist, congers 10 to 13 feet long and brightly colored with green, blue, and yellow. 3-foot-long hakes, whose liver is so tasty. Copolet, tene, floating like thin seaweed, gurnards, which poets call lyre fish, and fishermen call pipers, whose snouts are adorned with 2 triangular plates which resemble Homer's instrument. Flying gurnards, which can swim as fast as birds can fly, a species of perch with a red head, whose dorsal fin is decorated with a kind of filament, shad covered with black, gray, brown, blue, yellow, and green spots. A fish that is easily affected by the silvery sound of little bells. Magnificent turbots, those pheasants of the sea, whose diamond-shaped bodies are marbled with brown and yellow on top, and whose yellow fins are flecked with brown. And finally, schools of marvelous red mullets, the ocean's equivalent of birds of paradise, for which Romans would pay as much as 10,000 sesterces apiece, so that they could cruelly watch them change from deep vermilion to pale white as they died on their table. But I was able to see no miralets, triggerfish, tetradons, seahorses, wands, bellows, fish, blennies, surmullets, wrasse, smelt, flying fish, anchovies, sea bream, boops, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, orphes, or any representatives of the order of Pleuronid, this is a good one, Pleuronectidae, common to the Atlantic and Mediterranean, such as dabs, flounders, plaice, or sole. This was because of the dizzy speed with which the Nautilus traveled through these rich waters. As for sea mammals, I thought I saw near the mouth of the Adriatic 2 or 3 cachalots belonging to the genus of the sperm whale, with one dorsal fin, several dolphins of the genus Globicephala, found only in the Mediterranean, which have the front part of their heads striped with little bright lines, and also a dozen or so seals with white bellies and black fur, known as monk seals, and looking just like 10-foot-long Dominicans. Conseil thought he could make out a turtle with a shell 6 feet across and with 3 ridges down its back. I was sorry not to have seen this reptile, for from Conseil's description, I thought it must have been a rather rare species called a leatherback. The only reptiles I saw were several kokkens with elongated shells. As for zoophytes, I was able to gaze admiringly for several seconds at a marvelous orange-colored Galliolaria, which stuck to the port window. It consisted of a long, slender filament spreading out into an infinite number of branches and ending in the finest lace ever spun by Arachne's rivals. I was unfortunately not able to capture this splendid specimen. I undoubtedly would have seen no other Mediterranean zoophytes if, during the night of the 16th, the Nautilus had not reduced its speed considerably. It did so because we were then passing between Sicily and the coast of Tunis, and in this narrow space between Cape Bon and the Straits of Messina, the ocean floor rises abruptly. At this point, it comes to within 60 feet of the surface, whereas on each side it goes down to depths of 250 feet. The Nautilus therefore had to maneuver carefully in order to avoid this underwater barrier. I showed Conseil the position of this long reef on a chart of the Mediterranean. "If monsieur does not mind my saying so," observed Conseil, "it's like an isthmus connecting Europe to Africa." "Yes, my boy," I answered. "It cuts across the entire Straits of Libya, and Smith's soundings have proved that between Cape Boeo and Cape Farina, the continents were once upon a time connected." "I can easily believe it," said Conseil. "And what's more," I went on, "a similar barrier existed once between Gibraltar and Ceuta, completely cutting off the Mediterranean." "What would happen," asked Conseil, "if someday volcanic action again raised these barriers above the surface of the water?" "I doubt that would ever happen, Conseil. But, with monsieur's permission, if it ever did happen, it would come as quite a shock to Monsieur de Lesseps, who was going to so much trouble to build the Suez Canal." "Yes, but as I said before, it won't happen. The violence of the forces beneath the Earth's surface is constantly diminishing. Volcanoes, which were so numerous when the world was young, are slowly dying down. The temperature of the Earth's inner surfaces lowers appreciably each century, which will eventually have unfortunate results for this heat. For this heat is life. But there is the sun." "The sun isn't enough, Conseil. Can the sun give heat to a corpse? No, not that I know of. Well, my friend, one day the earth will be a cold corpse. It will become uninhabitable, and it will be as deserted as the moon, which lost its vital heat long ago. How many centuries will that take? Asked Conseil. Several 100,000 years, my boy. Well, then, said Conseil, we'll at least have enough time to finish our trip, unless Ned Land botches things up. Conseil felt reassured and went back to studying the shallow bottom above which the Nautilus was slowly cruising. There, on a rocky volcanic bottom, lay a whole world of living flowers, sponges, sea slugs, transparent Cydipiae, the reddish cirri emitting a light phosphorescence, barrows, commonly known as sea cucumbers, bathed in a gleaming rainbow of light, feather stars, a yard long, turning the water red, tree-like urales of great beauty, Pavanaceae, with long stems, a great number of edible sea urchins of various species, and green sea anemones, with grayish trunks and brown discs almost lost beneath their mass of olive-colored tentacles. Conseil spent his time more especially observing mollusks and articulata, and even though a list of what he saw might make somewhat dry reading, I feel it would be wrong to leave out his personal observations. In the subkingdom of mollusks, he cites numerous scallops, spondylii, triangular wedge shells, trident-shaped hyalea, with yellow fins and transparent shells, orange-colored pleurobranchia, looking like eggs flecked with green spots, Aplysia, also known as sea hares, Dolobelli, chubby acerae, umbrella shells found only in the Mediterranean, ear shells, which produce a much sought-after mother of pearl, red scallops, beaked cockles, which the people from the south of France prefer to oysters. Another kind of cockle very popular in Marseille. Some of those clams so common off the coast of North America, and which are eaten in such quantities in New York, comb shells of various colors, lithodes hiding inside their holes, whose flesh has a peppery taste I liked very much, furrowed Venicardiae, whose bulging shells are covered with ridges, Cynthiae, covered with scarlet bumps, Carnariae, bent up at each end, looking like small gondolas, Atlantes, with spiral shells, gray thetes, with white spots, and covered with their fragile mantilla, Aeolides, looking like little slugs, Caveolinae, crawling along their backs, Auriculae, and, among others, the Auricula myosotis, with its oval shell, fawn-colored Scalare, periwinkles, Ianethae, Cinerariae, Petricolae, Lamellariae, cabochons, Pandoras, etc. As for articulata, in Conseil's notes, they are rightly divided into 6 classes, 3 of which belong to the marine world. These are crustaceans, Sauropoda, and annelids. Crustaceans are divided into 9 orders, and the first of these comprise the Decapods, that is to say, animals whose head and thorax is usually united, those whose mouth consists of several pairs of jaws, and who possess 4, 5, or 6 pairs of legs on their thorax. Conseil followed the method of our master Milne Edwards, and divided them into 3 sections, Brachyura, Macrura, and Anomura. Even though these names are somewhat uncouth, they are correct and precise. Among the Brachyura, Conseil cites Amathiae, whose head is armed with two horns going off to each side, in Inichidae, which, and I have no idea why, the Greeks used as a symbol of wisdom. Several kinds of spider crabs, one species of which had probably wandered into this shallow water, for it usually lives at great depths. Xanthi, Piluminae, rhomboids, granular calapae. Very easy to digest, as Conseil notes. Toothless choristists, Eboliae, Cimobolidae, woolly doripi, etc. Among the Macrura, which are divided into 5 families, Ceriaceae, burrowers, Astaceae, Palamonidae, Oxodopods, he cites rock lobsters, the female of which is so good to eat, scalari or squills, and all sorts of edible species. But he says nothing of the subdivision of Astaceae, which includes the lobsters proper. Finally, among the Anomura, he saw Drociniae, there we go, sheltered inside the abandoned shells they had picked up. Homoliae, with their spiny head, hermit crabs, porcelain crabs, etc. There Conseil stopped. He did not have enough time to complete the class of crustaceans by an examination of sotomatopods, amphipods, homopods, isopods, trilobites, brachiopods, ostracods, and entomostraceae. And in order to complete his study of marine articulata, he should have mentioned the class of Sauropoda, which comprises cyclops, arguli, and the class of annelids, which he would not have forgotten to divide into tubicoles and dorsibranches. But once the Nautilus had passed the shallow water of the Straits of Libya, it again started cruising at its usual speed in the deeper water. From then on, observing mollusks, articulata, or zoophytes was out of the question. We saw only large fish which passed by like shadows. During the night of February 16th through 17th, we entered the second basin of the Mediterranean, which in places goes down to depths of 10,000 feet. By using its inclined planes and the force of its propeller, the Nautilus dove down to the deepest parts of the sea. There, although there were no natural wonders to admire, the ocean offered many moving and horrifying scenes. We were crossing that part of the Mediterranean in which so many ships had gone down. How many ships had disappeared forever between the coast of Algeria and the shores of Provence? The Mediterranean is only a lake compared to the vast expanses of the Pacific, but it is a capricious lake with changing moods. Today it is gentle and caressing for the frail tartan which seems to float between the ultramarine blue of its water and sky, and tomorrow it is raging and tormented, lashed by winds, smashing the strongest ships with its narrow waves which strike without warning. So in this trip through the depths, I saw innumerable wrecks lying on the ocean floor, some already encrusted with coral and others only covered with a layer of rust. I also saw anchors, cannons, shot, iron fittings, parts of engines, broken cylinders, staved-in boilers, and hulls occasionally floating upright and other times upside down. Of these wrecked ships, some had perished in collisions and others had struck granite reefs. I saw ships which had foundered with their masts still in place and their rigging stiffened by the water. They looked as if they were anchored in some open roadstead and waiting for the moment to depart. When the Nautilus passed among them and bathed them in its electric light, I felt as if these ships were going to dip their flags and salute. But no, there was nothing but silence and death in this field of sorrow. I noticed that the number of wrecks increased as we approached the Straits of Gibraltar. The shores of Africa and Europe are closer together there, and collisions are common in this narrow space. I saw many iron hulls, eerie wrecks of steamers, some lying flat on the bottom and others standing on end like huge animals. One of these boats presented a terrifying spectacle with holes in its side, its funnel bent, its paddle wheels destroyed except for their mountings, its rudder separated from its stern post, but still held on by a chain, and its rear nameplate eaten away by the sea. How many lives must have been lost on this shipwreck? How many victims must have gone down with it? Had some sailor survived to tell of this terrible disaster, or did the ocean still keep the secret of what had happened? I don't know why, but it struck me that this boat buried in the ocean could be the Atlas, which had disappeared with all hands about 20 years before, without another word ever being heard of it. What a grim task it would be to write a history of the Mediterranean depths. This vast cemetery where so much wealth has been lost and where so many victims have met their death. Nevertheless, the Nautilus cruised at full speed past all these wrecks with total indifference. On February 18th, toward 3 in the morning, it reached the entrance to the Straits of Gibraltar. There are two currents in these straits, one on the surface, which men have known about for a long time, and which brings water from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean. Then a lower countercurrent, whose existence has been proved in recent times by means of simple logic. For the amount of water in the Mediterranean, if it were constantly increased by that entering from the Atlantic and from rivers, would increase year by year, since mere evaporation would not be enough to reestablish its balance. Now, since the water level in fact stays the same, people were forced to admit to the existence of a lower current which empties water from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic. And this fact is indisputable. It was this counter-current of which the Nautilus took advantage. It moved rapidly through the narrow straits. For an instant I could make out the marvelous ruins of a temple of Hercules, which, according to Pliny and Avianus, had been buried along with the low island on which it stood. Then, several minutes later, we were floating on the surface of the Atlantic. Chapter 32, Vigo Bay. The Atlantic, that vast body of water with an area of 25 million square miles, a length of 9,000 miles, and an average width of 2,700 miles. This great ocean was almost completely unknown to the ancients, except perhaps to the Carthaginians, those Dutchmen of antiquity, who in their commercial wanderings explored the western coasts of both Europe and Africa. This ocean, with its immense parallel coasts, is watered by the world's largest rivers: the St. Lawrence, the Mississippi, the Amazon, the Plata, the Orinoco, the Niger, the Senegal, the Elbe, the Loire, and the Rhine, which bring it water from both the most civilized and the most barbaric countries on earth. It is a magnificent plain, constantly furrowed by ships of all nations and ending in those two terrible capes so feared by mariners, Cape Horn and the Cape of Good Hope. The Nautilus's prow was now cutting through the waters of this ocean, after having covered almost 10,000 leagues in 3.5 months. In 3.5 months, a distance greater than a great circle of Earth. Where were we going now, and what did the future have in store for us? After leaving the Straits of Gibraltar, the Nautilus had headed for the open sea. It could now surface without fear, and we could resume our daily walks on the platform. I immediately went up with Ned Land and Conseil. 12 miles away, we could vaguely make out Cape St. Vincent, the southwestern tip of the Spanish peninsula. A fairly strong wind was blowing from the south, and the sea was running high, making the Nautilus roll considerably. It was almost impossible to stand up on the platform because of the waves constantly buffeting the ship. We therefore went back down. After taking several breaths of air, I returned to my cabin and Conseil to his, but the Canadian, looking rather preoccupied, followed me. Our quick trip through the Mediterranean had not allowed him to carry out his plans, and his disappointment could be clearly read in his face. After closing the door of my room, he sat down and looked at me silently. "Ned," I said, "I know how you feel, but you're not to blame. At the speed the Nautilus was traveling, it would have been madness to try and escape." Ned Land didn't answer. I could tell by his frown and pursed lips that he was obsessed by a single thought. "Look," I continued, "all hope isn't lost. We're heading for Portugal, and from there it isn't far to France or England, where we'll easily be able to find refuge. Now, if the Nautilus had headed south after leaving the Straits of Gibraltar and made for the open sea, then I would be worried too. But now we know Captain Nemo doesn't avoid civilized regions, and in several days I think we'll be able to act with some security." Ned Land looked at me yet more fixedly, and then finally, parting his pursed lips, he said, "We'll do it tonight." I got up suddenly. I must admit, I was not prepared for this. I wanted to answer him, but words failed me. "We agreed to wait for an opportunity," Ned Land continued, "and now it's come. Tonight we'll be only several miles from the Spanish coast. It'll be dark, and the wind's coming in from the sea. You gave me your word, Monsieur Aronnax, and I'm counting on you." Since I still said nothing, the Canadian got up and came over to me. "Tonight at 9, he said. "I've told Conseil. At that time, Captain Nemo will be in his room and probably in bed. Neither the mechanics nor any members of the crew can see us. Conseil and I will go to the central companionway while you wait in the library right next door, waiting for my signal. The oars, mast, and sail are in the dinghy. I've even been able to store some provisions in it. I've also gotten a hold of a monkey wrench to undo the bolts which fasten the dinghy to the hull of the Nautilus. So everything's ready. I'll see you tonight." "But the sea is quite rough," I said. "I know it is," replied the Canadian, "but that's a risk we have to take. Freedom's worth paying for. Besides, the boat's well built, and several miles with a following wind is nothing much to worry about. We have to try it tonight, because for all we know by tomorrow the Nautilus might be 200 miles out to sea. If things run according to plan, between 10 and 11 o'clock, either we'll have reached some spot on dry land, or we'll be dead. May God be with us till tonight." With that, the Canadian departed, leaving me dumbfounded. I had assumed that in such a situation I would have time to think it over and discuss it. My stubborn companion had not allowed this to happen. But then what could I have said? Ned Land was right 100 times over. A reasonably good chance was being offered us, and we had to take advantage of it. How could I go back on my word and jeopardize the future of my companions for purely personal reasons? Besides, it was true that by tomorrow Captain Nemo might have taken us far from any land. Just then, a rather loud whistling noise told me that the reservoirs were being filled, and the Nautilus dove beneath the surface. I stayed in my room. I wanted to avoid the captain so that my emotions would not betray me. It was a sad day for me, torn as I was between the desire to regain my freedom and regret at abandoning this marvelous Nautilus and leaving my underwater studies incomplete. How I hated leaving my Atlantic, as I called it, without having seen its deepest waters and uncovered its secrets as I had with the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. It was like putting down a novel after the first volume or interrupting a dream at its most exciting moment. The hours passed by painfully as I either imagined myself safely on land with my companions or wished, in spite of what reason told me, that some unforeseen circumstance would prevent Ned Land from carrying out his plan. Twice I went to the lounge. I wanted to check the compass. I wanted to see if the Nautilus was taking us nearer or farther from the coast. But the ship stayed in Portuguese waters. It was heading north, fairly near the shore. I therefore had to make up my mind and prepare to escape. My luggage wasn't heavy. There were only my notes and nothing else. As for Captain Nemo, I wondered what he would think of our escape, whether it would worry him or actually do him harm. I also wondered what he would do in the case either that our attempt did succeed or did not. I certainly had no cause for complaint. Quite the contrary, I had never seen such hospitality as his, but he could not consider me ungrateful for wanting to leave him. No promise bound us to him. He counted on retaining us on board merely by the force of circumstance and not by our word. But his frankly admitted intent of keeping us forever prisoners justified any attempt we might make to escape. I had not seen the captain since our visit to Santorin Island. Would fate bring us face to face again before my departure? This was something I both desired and feared. I listened for his footsteps in the room next to mine. There was nothing but silence. His cabin was undoubtedly empty. Then I began to wonder if this strange person was really on board. Since the night the dinghy had left the Nautilus on some mysterious errand, I had somewhat changed my ideas about him. In spite of what he had told me, I felt that Captain Nemo had perhaps maintained some kind of communication with dry land. Was it true that he never left the Nautilus? Often, I had not seen him for weeks on end. What was he doing during that time? Wasn't it possible that he was carrying out some secret mission completely unknown to me? All these ideas and 1,000 others passed through my mind. In our peculiar situation, I would go on guessing like this forever. I felt very uneasy. This waiting was unbearable. The hours passed by much too slowly for my impatient mood. As always, dinner was served in my room. I ate badly, for I was too preoccupied. I got up from the table at 7. There were 120 minutes to go, and I began counting them before I was to rejoin Ned Land. I became more and more nervous. My heart was beating violently. I couldn't stay still. I paced back and forth, hoping that the physical movement would calm me down. The idea of dying in our daring adventure was the least of my worries, but the thought of our plans being discovered before we could get away from the Nautilus, and of being brought before Captain Nemo, who was angry, or worse yet, saddened by my wanting to abandon him, made my heart beat yet faster. I wanted to see the lounge one last time. I went down the gangway and entered this museum in which I had spent so many pleasant and useful hours. I looked at all the riches and treasures as a man about to be exiled for life, one leaving never to return. Never again would I see these wonders of nature and these masterpieces of art, among which so much of my life had been spent lately. I wanted to look out the window at the Atlantic, but the panels were hermetically closed, and a steel-plated wall separated me from this ocean I did not yet know. As I wandered about the lounge, I arrived at the door giving uh, giving onto the captain's cabin. To my great astonishment, it was ajar. I stepped back involuntarily. I was afraid Captain Nemo might see me if he were in his room, but hearing no noise, I drew near. The room was empty. I pushed the door further open and took several steps inside. Still the same stark, monastic look. Just then I was struck by several etchings hanging on the wall, which I had not noticed on my first visit. They were portraits of those great men of history who had devoted their lives to some human ideal. Kosciuszko, a hero whose dying words were Fini Polide Bozzaris, the Leonidas of modern Greece; O'Connell, the defender of Ireland; Washington, the founder of the American Union; Manning, the Italian patriot; Lincoln, felled by the bullet of a partisan of slavery; and finally, that martyr for the cause, the Negro emancipation, John Brown, hanging on his gallows just as Victor Hugo had drawn him. What bond existed between these heroic souls and Captain Nemo? Could I unravel some of the mystery of his existence from the collection of portraits? Was he a champion of oppressed peoples, a liberator of enslaved races? Had he played a role in the latest political and social upheavals of our century? Had he been one of the heroes of that terrible American Civil War, which had been both unfortunate and forever glorious? Suddenly the clock struck 8. The first blow of the hammer on the bell shook me from my reverie. I trembled as if an invisible eye had penetrated my most secret thoughts, and I rushed out of the room. I looked at the compass. We were still heading north. The log indicated a moderate speed, and the pressure gauge showed we were at a depth of about 60 feet. So everything was favoring the Canadians' projects. I went back to my room. I dressed myself warmly, sea boots, otterskin cap, and byssus coat, lined with seal fur. I was ready. As I waited, only the vibration of the propeller broke the deep silence on board. I listened, half expecting to hear shouts telling me that Ned Land had been caught trying to escape. I was seized by a mortal dread. I vainly tried to be calm and cool. At a few minutes before 9, I put my ear to the captain's door. Not a sound. I left my room and went to the dimly lit, deserted lounge. I opened the door leading to the library, the same half-light, the same solitude. I went over and took up my position near the door leading to the central companionway. I waited for Ned Land's signal. Suddenly, the vibrations of the propeller diminished considerably and then stopped completely. Why this change of speed? Would it help or hinder Ned's plans? I had no way of knowing. The silence was only broken by the beating of my heart. Then I heard a slight bump. I realized that the Nautilus had just come to rest on the ocean floor. My uneasiness increased. No signal from the Canadian. I wanted to find Ned Land and put off our attempt. We were no longer sailing under usual conditions. Just then, the door leading to the lounge opened, and Captain Nemo appeared. He noticed me, and without any kind of preamble, said amiably, "Ah, Professor, I was looking for you. Do you know your Spanish history?" Even if a person knew the history of his own country backward and forward, under such conditions, with his head swimming, he could not have remembered a single date. "Well," repeated Captain Nemo, Did you hear what I said? Do you know Spanish history? Very little, I replied. Learned men often have a lot to learn, said the captain. Well then, sit down and I'll tell you about a strange episode in Spain's history. The captain sat down on a divan, and I mechanically sat down next to him in the dimly lit room. Professor, he said, listen carefully. This story will be especially interesting to you, for it will answer at least one question you have not been able to solve. I'm listening, Captain, I said, not knowing what he was driving at, and wondering if this story would lead him around to our attempted escape. With your permission, Professor, said Captain Nemo, we'll go back to 1702. As you undoubtedly know, your King, Louis XIV, thinking he could make the Pyrenees disappear with a mere wave of his hand, had imposed his grandson, the Duke of Anjou, on the Spaniards. This prince, who took the name of Philip V, was not an especially good king, and had a particularly difficult time with foreign affairs. In fact, the previous year, the royal houses of Holland, Austria, and England had signed a treaty of alliance at The Hague with the intent of taking the crown of Spain from Philip V and placing it on the head of an archduke, to whom they prematurely gave the name Charles III. Spain had to face this coalition with scarcely any army or navy, but she was not without money, provided her galleons loaded with gold and silver from America could reach her ports. Now, toward the end of 1702, she was awaiting a rich convoy which was being escorted by 23 French ships commanded by Admiral Chateau-Renaud, in order to protect it from the coalition ships cruising the Atlantic. This convoy was due to put into Cadiz, but when the admiral found out that the English fleet was cruising in those waters, he decided to make for a French port. However, the Spanish commanders in the convoy protested against such a decision. They insisted on being taken to a Spanish port, and since Cadiz was out of the question, they resolved to go to Vigo Bay, on the northwest coast of Spain. Admiral Chateau-Renaud feebly gave in to their demands, and the galleons put into Vigo Bay. Unfortunately, this bay forms an open roadstead impossible to defend. The galleons, therefore, had to be unloaded quickly before the coalition ships could arrive, and there would have been plenty of time for this unloading if a miserable question of rivalry had not intervened. Are you following all this? Asked Captain Nemo. Yes, I replied, still not knowing why he was giving me this history lesson. I'll continue. This is what happened. By law, the merchants of Cadiz had the sole privilege of receiving all goods coming from the West Indies, and hence it would be going against their rights to unload the ingots at Vigo. They therefore complained to Madrid, and persuaded the weak Philip V to order that the convoy should remain at Vigo without unloading until the enemy fleet had disappeared. Now, while this decision was being taken on October 22nd, 1702, the English vessels arrived at Vigo Bay. Admiral Chateau-Renaud fought courageously in spite of his inferior forces, but when he saw that all the wealth of the convoy was about to fall into enemy hands, he set fire to the ships and scuttled them, and they all sank with their huge treasure. Captain Nemo stopped. I must admit that I had no idea why this story should be of any special interest to me. Well, then? I asked. Well, then, Monsieur Aronnax, replied Captain Nemo, we are now in Vigo Bay, and I leave it to you to unravel the rest of the story. The captain got up and asked me to follow him. By then I had recovered, and I obeyed. The lounge was dark, but through the transparent windows lay the sparkling sea. I looked out. Within a half-mile radius around the Nautilus, the waters were bathed in electric light. The sandy bottom was neat and clear. Some members of the crew had put on their diving suits and were clearing off half-rotted casks in the midst of the black wrecks of ships. The ground was strewn with bars of gold and silver coins and jewels spilling out of these casks. The men could pick up this precious booty, take it to the Nautilus, put down their loads, and then go back to this inexhaustible fishery of gold and silver. I understood. This was the scene of the Battle of October 22nd, 1702. This was the spot where the Spanish galleons had sunk. This was where Captain Nemo came to take the millions with which he would ballast his Nautilus. It was to him, and him alone, that South and Central America had delivered their precious metals. He was the direct and sole heir of this treasure, snatched from the Incas and the Indians conquered by Hernan Cortez. "Did you know, Professor," he asked with a smile, "that the sea contained such wealth?" "I know that the amount of silver suspended in seawater," I answered, "has been evaluated at 2,000,000 tons. "Undoubtedly, but in order to extract this silver, your expenses would be greater than your profits. But here I have only to pick up what the other men have lost, and not only in Vigo Bay, but also at 1,000 other scenes of shipwrecks marked on my underwater charts. Now, do you understand why I am a billionaire?" "Yes, I do, Captain. But let me say that by doing what you are here in Vigo Bay, you are merely anticipating the work of a rival company." "What company?" "A company to which the Spanish government has given the right to search for these sunken galleons. The stockholders have had their appetites whetted by the thought of enormous profits, and for the amount of gold and silver at the bottom of the bay has been evaluated at $100 million. $100 million? Replied Captain Nemo. "There used to be that much, but it's no longer there." "The charitable thing to do, therefore," I said, "would be to warn the stockholders. But who knows if such a warning would be well received? Gamblers usually prefer to lose their money than abandon their mad hopes. But when all's said and done, I feel less sorry for them than for the thousands of poor people who could have benefited by such wealth if it had been well distributed, whereas now it will be forever useless to them." I had no sooner expressed this regret when I felt that it must have offended Captain Nemo. "Useless?" he replied excitedly. "Do you think, monsieur, that this wealth is lost when I am the one gathering it? Do you think I do it just for myself? What makes you assume I don't make good use of it? Do you think I don't know that there's suffering and oppression on earth? Poor people to be comforted, victims to be avenged? Don't you understand?" Captain Nemo stopped, perhaps regretting he had talked so much. But it was enough for me to see that whatever had forced him to seek freedom beneath the sea, he was still a man. His heart still beat for the sufferings of humanity, and his immense charity extended to enslaved races as well as to individuals. And then I understood for whom these millions had been destined when the Nautilus had stopped near Rebel Crete. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 32. And there we go. A lot of stuff going on, a lot of Latin descriptions. So I again apologize for any of my probably frequent mispronunciations. But our plot is going along. Will our heroes escape or not? As I'm looking at this, we still have a good chunk of story left, so I have had an impression that they will probably not escape immediately, but we'll see what happens in the future. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've been reading along, and I hope you can be with us on Wednesday at 4 p.m., and we'll read the next 2 chapters of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.